Energy Media readers, today we're going to be interviewing Professor Chris Cochrane from the University of Toronto, and we're going to be talking about Western alienation, but from a non-Western perspective. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Now, I want to frame the question like this. So back many years ago, well, in the mid-1980s, when I was a graduate student at the University of Saskatchewan, the Western Canada Concept Party held a presentation, a rally in Saskatoon, and out of curiosity, I went. And I heard at that time a lot of the same angst and issues. Some of the issues were the same, some of the issues were different, but that same sort of alienation. And I remember thinking at the time that a lot of this appeared to be issues that could be resolved within the structure of Confederation, and that maybe these were people who were sort of ginning up the controversy for their own political purposes. And of course, Western Canada Concept Party elected one MLA in Alberta at a by-election and then faded away and was done. But now fast forward 35 years, and I feel it's the same issues or similar issues, the same kind of angst, and I suspect, again, the folks are ginning up and fomenting this Western alienation to further other agendas. That's the context. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You could think back to the early 1980s. There's very intense division in the country, lots of Western alienation, going back to the National Energy Program. These things were mentioned and talked a lot about even in the early 1990s. When sort of with the rise of Reform Party on the federal level, a lot of discussion there again of Western alienation. And now we see some signs of really those same patterns reemerging. And I think what surprises me the most probably from talking to people here is just how little they remember or even know about what happened in the early 90s or again going back to the 1980s. So it's my view that people in Alberta and Saskatchewan have a memory for things that have happened in the past because it's involved them and implicated them directly, but a lot of people here don't have that memory. So as much as people are thinking about it, they're bewildered and mystified by it more than anything.
That's a really good point, and you'll be pleased to know that when I did my BA and undergraduate and graduate degree was in history, and you referenced the national the national strategy. Yeah, thank you, which was about turning basically Western Canada with its resource development, turning it into a market for Eastern Canadian manufactured goods. And building a railway to connect the two. And so the idea of the West as a hinterland has long been part of Canadian political history, and the resentments that come with being the hinterland is part of Western Canadian political culture. At least it is on the prairies for sure. And I can understand why it's institutionalized or it's still remembered in the West and maybe not so much in the East because things have changed, so much over the years. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is. I would certainly distinguish different parts of the East. In Toronto, for example, 50% or more of the city is born elsewhere. So a lot of these aspects of Canadian history weren't things that they themselves or even their immediate ancestors lived through and experienced and passed on. So there's a newness here that doesn't exist elsewhere. And I also think there's a pretty significant urban-rural cultural divide in Ontario. So Ontario, geographically, I suspect, would align in many respects with a lot of the same sentiments you hear coming out of Alberta. The greater Toronto region is a little bit distinctive. And obviously Quebec is quite different in its own way, especially in the way that it sees Alberta, but also the way that it sees generally the rest of the country. And Atlantic Canadians are different still. So there is quite a diversity of views here. And even if sometimes they do seem to align from a sort of bewilderment to even perhaps in some cases a hostility, I think it's very difficult to characterize an Eastern perspective beginning from the sort of Manitoba border eastward.
How, without generalizing too much, is it fair to say that the kind of political fulminations of Premier Jason Kenney in Alberta are well received out east, poorly received out east, or simply, as you say, met with bewilderment because nobody understands them?
I think it really depends on sort of who's receiving it. I think the messages that Jason Kenney is sending out it's not just obviously an economic message, and it's not even a message just of regional grievance. There's a very strong cultural argument about the kind of person and the kind of work that's being done in Alberta. So it's often focused on the trades, it's often blue collar oriented. And so I think that argument really resonates with large segments of Ontario. It doesn't resonate as much in my experience within the immediate area of the city of Toronto, but it does resonate with a lot of folks elsewhere. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. And then when it comes to Quebec, I think it's a very different case there. I mean, you see even sort of some needling of Alberta, it seems to me, by the leader of the Bloc Québécois. Certainly, François Legault has not expressed much support at all to try to make things any easier. And why would they? These aren't parties that are adamantly committed to a national vision of the country. And so if there's an opportunity, certainly from the perspective of the Bloc Québécois, if there's an opportunity to further intensify regional grievance and to further separate other parts of the country, whatever it is, politically, culturally, or any other way, from Quebec, that's actually basically their stated mission. So it's not at all a surprise to see that either.
Now, there's some talk, and Jason Kenney, I think, has made this point himself, is that Alberta will be taking a more Quebec-like strategy, trying to elevate the Alberta's status as being unique within the Confederation and needing unique accommodations as Quebec has demanded and accomplished over the years. So if the way I look at this, and I have argued in columns, is that you catch more Canadians with honey than you do with vinegar. And so I've been critical of the Premier's fight back strategy, pushback strategy, the strategy of picking enemies like foreign funded activists and beating up on them, and Quebec is often a target. What's your take?
Yeah, it's a great question. I wish I had a sort of authoritative answer to that. I mean, obviously, you'd like to certainly be of the view that a province that's collaborative and working hard within Confederation would get ahead, and provinces that are more combative wouldn't. I think it depends ultimately on what the interests of the two sides are. I mean, one of the things that I probably really couldn't exaggerate is just the degree of concern among certain segments of the population, especially in my experience here in the city of Toronto, with the issue of climate change. It's a dominant issue, and it's not just an issue like healthcare was in the 90s, not to say healthcare is an important issue, where it was the thing everybody just mentioned because it was the one thing they had heard of. People here seem to be absolutely sincere and adamant in their concern with this issue. And it seems to me it's very difficult to reconcile that with the aspirations of especially Alberta in the north as far as developing the oil sands go. So to the degree that these interests aren't reconcilable, I think it's going to be very difficult for any leader, let alone this prime minister, to find a compromise.
Now, on October 22nd, the day after the federal election, I wrote a column in which I said, given the fact that we now have a minority Liberal government and will be supported, presumably by the NDP, which has an even more assertive and aggressive climate plan, everybody knows that the road to meeting Paris 2030 targets and net zero emission in 2050 runs through Alberta. And both the Kenney government and the industry, represented in this case by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, is pushing back hard on this issue. And if you were a cynical journalist like me, you might think that a lot of this whipping up of Western alienation and talk of separating, Alberta separating from Canada, was really in anticipation and preparation for the very difficult conversations, political conversations that will be had over implementation of a more aggressive climate plan. What do you make of that?
I mean, I certainly think that obviously the oil industry is lobbying and influencing politics. They have messaging that they're sending out about the nature of Alberta oil. I don't think those messages are really resonating here. At least they're not, as far as I can tell. I think there's a number of challenges with the sort of on this file that are very serious ones and that have tangible implications for people. But not the least of it is, if we're in a situation where the federal government is trying to impose some sort of incentive to reduce emissions in Canada, and if those incentives do have the effect of reducing emissions here in Canada, but simply increasing emissions somewhere else, say production moves to the United States, for example, I think that's the kind of thing that doesn't achieve the stated objectives that the government is actually pursuing and makes it even harder for people in Alberta to stomach. So whatever happens, and I suspect this issue is going to be resolved because it has to be, I do think that there does need to be a greater sort of meeting of heads and a greater understanding between the perspectives of the different sides. One of the things that struck me in the last election, for example, when I heard some of the early discussions about the shift away from carbon economy toward a green economy, there was some discussion about more or less the welfare state taking care of the people who would be effectively unemployed by this in northern Alberta. And I wondered if the people who came out with that messaging had actually gone up and met anybody in northern Alberta who was working in the industry. Because if I was trying to craft a message to entice people to become more supportive of a move away from petroleum production and toward other kinds of industries, probably the last thing I would say to them is, don't worry about it. The welfare state, unemployment insurance, and these other initiatives will take care of you. So I think that kind of messaging needs to be substantially improved on the pro-environmental side.
That's very interesting, and I think that's a perfectly legitimate point. So there are a couple of strategies here that around energy issues that are being, one is being floated and one is being implemented. So the one that's being implemented is Jason Kenney wants to fight with everybody that doesn't wear an "I love oil and gas" t-shirt, and he's doing that. We've got the foreign-funded activist public inquiry. We've got a $30 million energy war room. There's going to be money available for First Nations to challenge other anti-development First Nations. There is going to be money to fight. And then on the other side, there are people connected to the energy industry who are saying, hang on a second, we already have a polarized debate around energy. What we need to do is depolarize that. We need to have adult conversations about what's doable, when it's doable, implementation, all of that sort of thing. So if you're sitting there as a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, which strategy do you think is more likely to be successful in generating some sort of concessions from the federal government or engaging Canadians outside of Alberta and Saskatchewan?
Another very good question, and a hard one for me to answer. I mean, I can certainly say that the pro-oil agenda and the intensity of pro-oil rhetoric in Alberta, I would say, is matched here by an anti-oil rhetoric and comments which would be just as, in my view, just as sort of the extreme, but on the other side, which is we need to shut it all down nearly immediately. Consequences, whatever, for the economy and for workers are sort of not really considered. I don't think those are the positions that governments ultimately are going to adopt, obviously, but certainly they're voices governments have to be able to navigate. This is a quintessential example of where federal leadership is needed, and federal leadership not just in terms of crafting policies that actually work, but also bringing people on board and convincing them that the federal government, even if it can't give them everything they want, can at least give them something, and at the very minimum, give them the respect that they deserve. And so the Prime Minister, and this Prime Minister in particular, is in a very difficult position, and nobody is perfect, but I think it is worth pointing out that some of the early comments he made about, for example, Canada wanting to be known for what's between our ears and not beneath our feet, those kinds of comments do nothing at all except inflame the situation, turn it into more of a cultural issue and a cultural divisive issue than it needs to be. And I don't think that kind of comment is easy to recover from. So you have the Trudeau last name, which isn't lost, I know, on a lot of people in Alberta. You have that sort of view of the out of touch Central Canadian or Eastern Canadian elite. And then you have a comment like that. So it's going to be an extremely difficult job for this government to demonstrate the kind of national leadership that this situation certainly requires.
Given the context of your comments, what do you make then of his appointment of Chrystia Freeland, who grew up in Alberta, as Deputy Prime Minister? Will she kind of be the emissary to resolve these issues out in Western Canada?
Yeah, I think she's his strongest cabinet minister, has been his strongest cabinet minister for a long time. She's supremely competent. She's from Alberta. She has connections there. I think she probably is going to, I know, I'm very confident she's going to resonate there much more than Trudeau would. And I heard some discussion, for example, that he was setting her up basically in a position to fail or putting her in a very difficult situation where she was going to have to try to salvage an unsalvageable scenario. I don't actually think that's the case. I think this is somebody who can speak really to both worlds. She can speak to people in Alberta, and she clearly can speak to the Prime Minister. And if she pulls off this job, it's just going to be yet another, I think, achievement for her in federal politics, and we'll see where that goes. I mean, some certainly would say that she's much more competent than the Prime Minister is, and I think certainly better positioned to address this than anybody else in cabinet.
Now, Chris, I'd be interested to get your response to an argument that I've made for a number of years in columns, and that is that the context, the political context, the policy context within which the Alberta energy industry, the oil and gas and pipeline industry operates has changed dramatically. It has changed because of the shale production down in the US, that's changed markets. It's changed because of the energy transition. Oil now has finally has, after 150 years, has a competitor in the form of electricity. And it's changed because of the climate crisis and the way that has affected people's attitudes towards policy and the energy transition. So my argument is that what might have worked 20 years ago for the industry, which is basically lobbying government, that's what they do the best, now needs to change, and they need to engage Canadians in key markets like BC, Ontario, and Quebec to rebuild some of the political legitimacy they have lost, I would argue, especially around pipelines. And there's some onus on them to do more of that kind of work. What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a pickle for the industry, and it's not my primary area of expertise. But as you mentioned, there are things happening in the world that are changing the nature of the industry and making it more difficult to develop the industry, especially the oil sands in Alberta, when the world price of oil, or even the price of oil that they can get, is significantly lower than it was. I think, though, that there is some sense, and again, the accuracy of this is for the experts to ultimately adjudicate, but there's some sense that a lot of the problems that the industry in Alberta is facing aren't just about sort of general world issues, but are what we might even say self-inflicted by either other provinces, uncertainty about whether these products can get to their markets, the fact that there's a discounted price, the fact that investors may now be hesitant to invest at all, and the fact that comments are being made at the federal level which seem to indicate that there's a broader plan in place to move away from this industry altogether. So all of those things, I think, really put the federal government in the line of fire when there is a downturn, as there has been in the industry. So the federal government's not to blame for all of it, that's clear, but that doesn't mean the federal government won't be blamed for all of it. And I think there's a very high likelihood that that's in fact what we're seeing.
Now, this would be my final question. I'd be very curious to see what you think about this, because I've had the opportunity over the last few years to interview some pretty smart people. One, an economist, Michael C. Moore from the University of Calgary, who put out a paper in 2014, 2015, arguing that Canada needs a national energy strategy. We need to stop just bumbling along doing our development as whatever, however the market directs us. We need to do this more strategically. And another one is Dennis McConaughey, who is retired now, but was a vice president for TransCanada Pipeline, so knows the industry very well. And his argument is, or his question is, Canada has to decide whether it's in or out of the hydrocarbon industry. It can't play this, footsie and one, on the fence, one side in, one foot in, 1 foot out. It needs to make a decision whether it really wants a hydrocarbon industry that can survive into the low carbon future as we transition away from fossil fuels, because we'll be using some oil and gas for many, many, many decades yet. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, it reminds me in a way of the old joke, why did the Canadian politician cross the road? And the answer is to get to the middle. So there's this, I think there's this tendency of trying to find a compromise between interests that are obviously pointing in different directions. With respect to the need for a sort of a national strategy on energy, I think that certainly is the case. And, you'd mentioned very effectively some of the earlier things. We think of the national plan, for example, that basically built the country in the late 1800s, early 1900s. One of the things that I would really emphasize about that was that even though the government led it, the government at no point, the prime minister wouldn't have stood up and said, "Don't worry, we'll take care of all of this." It was a national plan that required work and labor by all kinds of different people in all kinds of different roles. And it seems to me that dealing with climate issues and balancing those with our current situation vis-a-vis energy and the economy is going to require that similar kind of an initiative. And if the federal government stands up and says, "Don't worry, we can take care of this," or "We'll take care of workers who are unemployed," or "We'll retrain," I think the idea that the people in the country are going to depend on the government to solve the problem for them is exactly the wrong messaging, because the issue is the other way around. the government is going to depend on the people of the country to solve the problem for them. And it's hard for me to imagine that we're going to be able to shift in any way, in any direction on a big issue like where we get our energy and how we orient our economy without people like the engineers, the chemists, and the people working currently in Northern Alberta. So I think the messaging around it certainly could be improved, and I suspect it will be over the next 5 or 10 years.
Chris, thank you very much for this. Has been a fascinating conversation, and I look forward to having more of them in the future because this issue, it ain't going away.
Nope, definitely not. Thanks a lot, Markham. Appreciate it.
Thanks. We'll look forward to talking to you again in the next interview.
Great. Thank you.